Good afternoon. My name is Marla Miller, and I direct the Public History program in the History Department, and it's my privilege to welcome you all to the Capstone event of the UMass History Department's Fall 2012 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. This afternoon, we're very proud to present three speakers who will help reshuffle the themes that we've been discussing all semester to help us contemplate history and truth, reconciliation, and justice. With their help today, we reflect on the major questions this series has sought to address about the complex relationship between seeking truth and studying history, and the tension between pursuing reconciliation and striving for justice. And I promise I won't take much of our time this afternoon before we get to the lecture itself or the panel itself, but I do want to begin with offering a few words of thanks to the people who have made this whole series possible. First, I'd like to recognize History Department Chair Joy Bowman, who I just saw come in, taking off her coat, for everything she's done to support the series this year, as well as History Department staff members, especially Jean Ball and Rochelle Viggers, who have taken care of all the paperwork that makes this kind of thing possible. I'd also like to thank members of the Feinberg Series Committee, Brian Bunk, Dan Chard, Jill Dwiggins, and Sigrid Schwarcz, who chaired the committee. And I'd like to recognize Alice Nash, who, yes, there she is, looking up, Alice Nash and Jane Anderson, who put together the outstanding symposium on Indigenous Peoples in Truth and Reconciliation that kicked the series off back in October. I also want to say a word about our graduate students. In addition to Dan and Jill, I want to recognize Samuel Dodge and Catherine Julian, who are hanging out in the back somewhere. I was thinking mostly this week about how much our department depends on the talent, the skills, and the good nature of our graduate students, who really do make the work of the History Department possible. So if we can, may we thank the History Department graduate students who have contributed to this series. They're excellent. I also want to add a special word of thanks to Sigrid Schwarcz. The whole series was Sigrid's conception. The minute that she proposed this as the topic for the 2012 Feinberg series, the whole department really embraced it. It seemed like a great fit between the things we think about every day in the History Department and the kinds of topics we want to bring before people. Sigrid has done the lion's share of the heavy lifting of all of the organization. She's been at all of these events. Her dedication and energy and thoughtfulness has been much appreciated by the department, so really thank you, Sigrid. And finally, I want to express our deepest appreciation to History Department alum Kenneth Feinberg, whose generosity makes it possible for us to offer a speaker series like this one every 2 years. For those who don't already know, Kenneth Feinberg is a nationally recognized lawyer who served as the director of the Congressional Fund to assist the families of those killed or injured in the attacks of September 11th, 2001. His book, What is Life Worth?, grew out of that experience. More recently, he's also overseen compensation for victims of the BP oil spill. Every 2 years, the department takes on a series that intersects a question at the intersection of history and policy. And so 2 years from now, we'll be exploring something new, and we'll be eager to see you all back then. We think the theme of this series, Truth, Reconciliation, History, and Justice, reflects Feinberg's interest very well, for he's always asking, what is our collective responsibility to victims, and what would it take to make things right for them? To help us conclude the semester's contemplation of those questions, we have three outstanding panelists, and to introduce them, we'll have my colleague, Rachel Martin.
Good afternoon, and let me also thank you for having taken time out of the last week of classes to come here today and listen to our final panel. As Marla said, my name is Rachel Martin, and I'm a professor here in the History Department. I teach a combination of public history and civil rights. So the questions related to history and ideas of reconciliation and finding the truth and finding ways towards peace are very important to my own work. Because it's the end of the semester and we're probably all a little muddy today, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists just before they speak so we can hopefully keep them straight instead of giving you a deluge of information at the front. So the first person we will be hearing from today is Elazar Barkan, who is the founding director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague. In addition, he is also the professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University, as well as the director of their Institute for the Study of Human Rights. His background is as a historian, and he earned his PhD at Brandeis University. And his research throughout his career has focused on these questions of human rights and the ways that we can use history in contemporary society and politics, in order to begin addressing moments of injustice and crime in the past. He has worked at times in more direct issues of human rights, and one of his interests is in bringing together scholars from different sides of the issue and putting them in conversation with each other to try to create new shared historical narratives that cross political divides. Some of his other research interests also include issues of refugee repatriation, the way historical commissions create their stories, ideas of shared sacred sites, and questions of human rights impact, especially with regard to redress and transitional justice. He has published a variety of works on these various topics. His most recent article that is pertinent to this is Historians and Historical Reconciliation, which was part of an AHR forum on this topic, which I understand at least a few of you have had to read before today. He also has books and edited collections which include No Return, No Refuge, Rights and Rights in Minority Repatriation, The Guilt of Nations, Restitution and Negotiating Historical Injustices, Claiming the Stones, Naming the Bones, Cultural Property and the Negotiation of National and Ethnic Identity, and Taking Wrong Seriously, Apologies and Reconciliation. So, let us welcome him.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming, and thank you for the kind invitation. And since this is a panel and not a long speech, I will take a few minutes. Can you hear me there? Yeah, I know you can. I'll take a few minutes to frame the way that I'm looking at these different topics, which much of it can glean from the kind of work that I've been doing. So transitional justice is a concept that has been around for about 2 decades and really emerged in the post-Cold War period in the process of democratization, and has become really an organizing principle I believe we're going to hear about the South African Commission later on, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa as the overwhelming example for the format in which a transition takes place. But when we come to talk about history, reconciliation, and justice, we are actually engaging different constituencies. And what I would like to do today is to lay out the different constituencies and to see what is the relationship between those constituencies and what are the challenges that we face, to my mind, in engaging with the narratives and with the conflicts, and how do we turn these kinds of interest and engagements with human rights into conflict resolution. So, briefly, the attitude to history, and I must recognize James Young here in terms of when we talk about the relationship of memory and history, there's few people to go to which are better than that equal that. I think that have engaged historians for a very long time, the relationship between memory and history, the questions of truth and history, and intellectually, historians are very much an ivory tower kind of a profession. It's really, by and large, are very hesitant to engage with real political issues, with real conflicts, with real questions of justice. On the other hand, the challenge is that the past is very much present in contemporary conflicts. And so how do we bridge this divide? Transitional justice is focused on the questions of accountability, and the questions of accountability is in two different perspectives. One of them is in two different mechanisms, excuse me. One of them is trials. How do you bring perpetrators to justice? And we go at least back to the Nuremberg trials as an example of where we bring the worst perpetrators to trial. And the second one is a truth commission, which is an invention from the 1980s, first in Latin America, then in South Africa. And that is telling the truth, focusing on testimonies, focusing on victims, and validating the experience. It's not so much about adversarial engagement with the truth. It's not like a trial where you get to the truth through an adversarial investigation, but it is through validation of the victims. And the victims have increasingly come to play a major role and the most important constituency in transitional justice. So how do we validate the victim's perspective? That's a major challenge. So whether it's through commemoration, through memories, through oral histories, through testimonies, truth commissions, all of those are different components in which we engage the victims. And in fact, I want to say, I'll try and say a few controversial things just to keep you up. But so let me say the first one, and that is that we consider victims as synonyms to virtues. That by and large, we have no mechanism or ethical framework by which to challenge victims' stories, perspectives, narratives. And as far as it goes, that's great. However, and that's what I think is the more problematic, victims also provide the fuel for a lot of revenge, for a lot of nationalist myth, for a lot of nationalist demands, and a lot of conflicts that are being embedded, in a victim's perspective. So I'm not going to resolve it right now. I just want to make a point that while transitional justice emphasizes more than anything else the perspective, the validations of victims, there is also a problem when we come to conflict resolution, how to incorporate the victim's perspective in a constructive manner, not only as a validation. And I'm not talking about lies now, I'm talking about people who actually believe in what they present. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what is the approach of conflict resolution to history? So, or what is the relationship of politics to history? So there are two bookends to this perspective. On the one hand is the conflict resolution perspective that says, let bygones be bygones. Forget about the past. There are interests, there is power. We need to negotiate with the contemporary, with the current problems. We need to negotiate with the powers that exist at the moment, and we have to bridge the two together. So you bring the protagonists into the same room and you say, what do you want? And how do we bridge the differences? And if it were possible, it's actually not a bad idea. However, I always like to refer to Günter Grass in this regard. Memory and history is like a clogged toilet. Right? It will just keep coming up. You can't put the past behind you. So, on the other hand, we have those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. That's the other bookend of approach to history. And we need to bridge those perspectives. We don't really have empirical evidence to actually say whether one is more true than the other. And one of the reasons that we don't have is the other problem that we engage, that I want to sort of highlight, underscore, is that we try and offer a universal solution to complex problems, that they have no universal solution. So sometimes you can overcome history and other times you cannot. And that's why transitional justice that provides, by and large, a one solution fits all. Listen to testimonies, validate the victims, bring perpetrators to justice, is adequate in many cases, but not adequate in other cases. Next point. Human rights, which informs greatly that kind of approach to victims, is by and large focused on individual rights. Human rights has very little to say about group as a constituency. In fact, we abhor the notions of collective guilt. If we are open to some kinds of collective identity, into some kind, we are more open to, we mentioned indigenous rights, so we are more open to collective indigenous rights, collective minority rights, etc. We really abhor the notion that there is a collective guilt, that a nation can be criminal in and of itself. However, when we come to, so we have the interests in human rights and the advocacy that comes from human rights that focuses on the individuals, and therefore transitional justice that is very much embedded in human rights language is focused on individual perpetrators. However, by and large, even the most developed cases, there is no way in which perpetrators of significant number will be brought to justice. In ethnic cleansing, in gross violations of human rights, in crimes of atrocity, as some people say, you get away with murder. Many people get away with murder. There is an intellectual dissonance when you focus on accountability as the response to perpetration of these kinds of crimes, and the inability to actually find responsibility with the people, with an ethnicity, with a group, with a nation. I'm not saying that they are all guilty, but I'm saying that there has to be some other framework in which this can be attended to. So those are dissonances and discrepancies that exist. Let me bring another complexity, another layers of complexity into it, and that many of contemporary conflicts are actually the result of past memories, or memories of the past are obviously memories of the past, not of anything else, but of past that is longer than the immediate past. There are no perpetrators to bring to justice. There are no living witnesses. There are no living victims. Yet, the memory is the most critical aspect of the relationship between the groups. And I use the groups to indicate nations, ethnicities, religions, what have you. Any identifying group. In order not to make it totally abstract, let me give you a couple of examples. Perhaps two that are, let me give you three examples that are most prominent in my mind, I think not exclusive, not too idiosyncratically. Turkey, Armenia. So in 2015, we'll commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And the relationship between Turkey and Armenia involve Azerbaijan, involve regional issues, etc. But they are overwhelmingly overdetermined by the memory, the acknowledgement, the lack of acknowledgement, the unwillingness to recognize the Armenian genocide. And in fact, the process of democratization that Turkey has been going through, it's not quite as dramatic as moving from a dictatorship to a democracy, but it is a longer process, and this process involves greatly the liberation of using the word genocide in Turkey. If you want, in the conversations, I can expand on it longer, but I'm mindful of the clock. The other example that you want to maybe remember is Japan and its colonial or neighbors, China and Korea, and some others, but primarily China and Korea. Again, after the Second World War, Japan and China overcame the notions of dealing with the past, but more recently, the memory of the Japanese colonialism, whether it started with the textbooks or whether it started with the comfort women, with the sex slaveries during World War II, and let me apologize if I'm going too fast for because some of those cases may not be as familiar to everyone, and I use it as in shorthand. So please ask me questions later. But I just want to try and give without the descriptions of each of these cases. But since the early 90s at least, Japan's relationship with its neighbors, while economically oftentimes great cooperation, the harsh political crises stem from historical memory that is not attended to. There is nothing in transitional justice that can tell us how to resolve the conflicts between China and Japan or Korea and Japan. A third case is the Balkans and the breakup of Yugoslavia. There are lots of reasons to talk about Milosevic and the manipulations of politics, etc. But at the background, the rhetoric that used to break up Yugoslavia was the Battle of Kosovo. And when the war took place, the language that was used was of Chetniks and Ustasha. The Chetniks were, these are warring, shall we say, factions, warring armies between Croatia and Serbia during World War II. So when the Croats wanted to indict the Serbs and to criticize the Serbs, they called them Chetniks. But lo and behold, the Chetniks, the Serbs nationalists also called themselves Chetniks. This was not just a negative, this was also self-affirming. And the same with the Ustasha. So the most nationalist, so you can't, there's nothing that exists at the moment, whether it's in conflict resolution mechanism that says let's talk about interest to the future, or in transitional justice that looks at courts and at truth commissions that would tell us how do we deal with this kind of issues. And if we look at Spain, the shift of the civil war, then Franco for 40 years, then 30 years, maybe 40 years. And then suddenly reawakens. The demand in Spain to deal with the past, with the memory of the violations of the civil war, comes almost 70 years after the war. Spain has been integrated into the EU. It's a democracy, but the toilet is still clogged. So sometimes it's between groups, sometimes it's within nations, but we have to take account of the existence of memory as an instigator of conflict. And this, I think, is the main challenge for historians. Many among historians crave the possibility to have impact, to be involved, to have their work more relevant. But on the other hand, the profession's self-perspective is such that I write my own work, and however good it is, it will be influential in whatever way, but I'm not cooperating with other historians to dialogue on history. And I think that's wrong, to put it mildly. I think we had an earlier conversation just before these sessions about the concept of truth and empiricism and theory, etc. So when I was a student, I read Peter Novak, so you can see that this is not a new issue for historians by any stretch. Over 120, probably more than 120 years, since the late 19th century, historians have been struggling with the questions of objectivity, subjectivity, truth, empirical truth, theoretical, etc. We can be so involved in this that we forget that for the victims who excavate mass grave, that is not a question. The validity of truth is not a question. Either the human remains are there and it belongs to their family, or they are not there. So there are different usages. The idea is not that there is one truth and therefore, and only one function for truth, but actually for conflict resolution, the truth is with this very small t, very empirical and very close. So close to one's own identity, to one's own truth, to one's own life and responsibility. So you have many nations, very famous among the Palestinians, that they carry the key to the house that doesn't exist. Now, you can't invalidate that. That doesn't make sense. It's not a questions about competing truths. It's questions of recognizing and acknowledging, and then the questions of bringing people together. There's a lot of nationalist myth that can be undone by actually investigating jointly the different perspectives of truth. How long do I have? I don't want to. Okay. So the challenge for historians is to actually bring professional perspective to a lot of good historical memory work that is being done by protagonists, advocates, not to invent something, but to actually help people do the kind of work that they are interested in a very professional manner. That's the first thing. So we have to remember that a lot of groups around the world, an increasing number of groups, are actually engaged, just like human rights advocacy. It's not, so let me put in parentheses. Human rights advocacy, when it started with Amnesty International, didn't think they'll change the world by writing a single letter here or there. I'm not proposing to you that having a historical discourse is going to change everything and will sort of euphoric truth, historical truth will resolve conflicts immediately. But there is a lot of room for historical discourse that brings the advocates and the practitioners, whether it's building memorials, whether it takes oral histories, whether it is doing education, textbooks. So what kind of truth is being, what kind of historical narrative is being presented in a textbook? So you have organizations that are dealing with that wonderfully, but they're often dealing with it from within the constraints of a very divisive historical narrative from one perspective or another. In some countries, like Rwanda, history is outlaw. It's too complicated, it's too conflicted, you can't engage it. This is a place where transitional justice can contribute to a limited way, and it's not to replace transitional. None of what I said is either to replace conflict resolution or transitional justice. It's one more area that has an important contribution that is not widely recognized. So I carve my space in there. So Rwanda or East Timor, history is not allowed in. Now, would that mean that the next time ethnic cleansing will come up, all the nationalist narrative will be there without actually anybody ever attempting to invalidate that? So here's my 2 cents about it. Like human rights advocacy, historical advocacy can benefit a lot from engaging historians at any stage in any conflict. There is no time that is too early, there's no time that is too late. it's not that you can't tell Israelis and Palestinians that there is no space for them for conversations. Those are two societies that are pluralistic. They have a wide political spectrum, and there are Israelis and Palestinians who are willing to speak to each other. Let them speak to each other. It's at the level of a civil society, even if the official history, the official state mechanism is not ready for that. In Japan, there was a lot of civil society work that contradicted the repression or the resistance of the government to deal with those issues. In Korea, you have civil society organizations that actually, while some of the energy of the government goes against Japan, others take the same kind of interest and engage it in further democratization and asking questions about Koreans' own historical perspective. So usually you don't hear, you study history of human rights, but less so we are engaged with history as human rights. And I think this is the challenge that perhaps I should leave you with, and we can talk more about in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker for this evening is actually one of our own. He is part of the history department here at UMass. He did his PhD at the University of Michigan, and he works as an African historian. He has published many articles in this field, including pieces that have been in African Economic History, the International Journal of African Historical Studies, the Journal of Social History, and other places. His first book, A Working Class in the Making on Mine Workers in the Belgian Congo in the First Half of the 20th Century, was published by the University of Wisconsin Press, and he is currently working on the hidden cost of industrialization, state violence, and the economic transformation of Southern Africa, 1900 to 1980. A project with clear importance in the present day as we witness violent struggles over mining and labor erupting in South Africa again. In addition, he teaches several very popular courses here in our department, including one that is on power and violence in South Africa. And he was an ex post facto researcher for the South Africans Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So, let us welcome John Higginson.
Professor Martin, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I'm very glad to be here. And I'm especially glad to be able to have a conversation with my fellow panelists. Professor Barkan has raised some very important issues which I intend to address, and from several different vantage points. The one that's most striking is how does one make perpetrators account for themselves, and where is the space for the victims in that process. I would recommend to you two books that I haven't just finished reading. I'm reading them, in any case, for a second, third time. One is a series of essays by a well-known Dutch anthropologist, Anton Blok, who wrote a wonderful book about mafia in a Sicilian village. But he also has a book of essays called Honor and Violence, which I strongly suggest you have a look at if you're interested in the topics that the Feinberg series has been concerned with today. The second book is a book by Timothy Snyder called Bloodlands, which has won numerous prizes, as you know, and has been translated into 20 or so languages. Professor Snyder comes at many of the points that Professor Barkan does, as I hope to do, and but from a slightly different vantage point, and I'm going to try to get to that at the end of what I have to say. I want to start with a quotation from somebody you all know, Adam Smith. And this comes from Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. Conservatives love to quote the first 39 pages of The Wealth of Nations about the invisible hand and all of that. But I would strongly suggest that they also go and read the theory of moral sentiments. At one point in that, Adam Smith says this. He says, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable." So you'll see the relevance of that in a moment. I'm hoping not to tell you a long, boring saga, but one that you can pick up and embrace. Looking back on the accomplishments of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, historian Colin Bundy observed, and I quote, "The TRC is a case study of how the past is contested and what the role of history is in shaping values and institutions in civil society." But how does Bundy's claim square with what actually happened in South Africa over the past 40 years? In particular, since, say, the lifting of the state of emergency in 1990-91, the April 1994 elections, and the drafting of a new constitution. Lawyers often tell us that a constitution's worth is demonstrated by how it protects a society's weakest and most marginalized individuals in their encounters and confrontations with the state. But what happens when such people have long traditions of contesting the state's legitimacy, as they do in South Africa, and the right to govern? Some of the most recent developments in South Africa grow out of the persistence of that in spite of the end of formal apartheid. State violence and terror in South Africa had a shockingly blunt political objective during the brief 4 years before the April 1994 elections: to wipe out or silence a large portion of the rural constituency of the recently unbanned political parties. That is, the African National Congress at that point. This was the time when Nelson Mandela was released from Pollsmoor prison, rather Victor Verster prison in Cape Town. All the cameras were focused on what was going on in the cities, and meanwhile, the security forces were killing people in droves in the rural areas. After 1992, the objective was made all the easier to achieve because of the inherent weaknesses of the Transitional National Executive, or the TNE as it was called. I lived under that, the Transitional National Executive, between 1992 and 1993, and I was going to bring my diary, the diary I kept during that time to give you some existential flavor of what it was like to live in South Africa during those times, but I forgot it, so please excuse me. The Transitional National Executive was the instrument of the negotiated settlement forged by the last apartheid government under F.W. de Klerk and the African National Congress. The TNE did not have the power to curtail, intervene in, or even monitor the activities of the state security forces. Its explicit brief was to lay out a procedure and context for popular elections by April 1994. Nothing more, nothing less, which left it at a decided disadvantage in contending with de Klerk's government over administrative and constitutional matters. It is impossible to make much sense of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission unless one ties it to the political settlement arrived at between 1990 and 1993, and its most palpable institutional expression, this Transitional National Executive, which grew out of the miscarried reforms of the closing phases of apartheid. The arrangement created a situation in which the white power structure, backed up by the army and security forces, was unable to suppress black opposition. Meanwhile, black opposition and the other forces arrayed against apartheid did not have the immediate capacity to overthrow the state, hence the negotiated settlement. But even the most generous understanding of quote-unquote negotiated settlement failed to touch on how subordinate groups would gain access to socio-economic resources, whether aggregate income would be distributed in a more democratic fashion. And this is an important question, as it is even today in South Africa. The ratio between, say, white wages and black wages is running somewhere between 1 to 12. So it persists as an important problem. How subordinate groups would gain access to socioeconomic resources, and whether aggregate income would be distributed in a democratic fashion, and how living conditions and access to education would be enhanced for the black majority. Also, the distance between the disclosure of the state's atrocities and justice continued to be substantial. The testimony and proceedings of the South African TRC are voluminous and instructive. They mark the first time in modern South Africa's history that an official body has encouraged people to speak freely about recent events and to speculate about how the violent excesses of the past might instruct the creation of a better, more democratic society. It may also mark one of the first times a modern state has frankly admitted that the prerequisites of a truly just society do not already exist. These frank admissions have encouraged discrete groups of people to assume a certain smugness about the authoritarian single-mindedness of the apartheid and segregation eras. Much like the people of another time who admired Mussolini and the Italian fascists because they appeared to make Italy's trains run on time, some in South Africa still believe that a measure of commonplace virtue existed in the certainties of South Africa's previous forms of social engineering, most immediately apartheid. Political virtue, however, is never commonplace. It requires more courage than force to maintain, and it demands a degree of skepticism about motives, interests, and outcomes that authoritarian governments find disturbing. Now, let me bracket that and talk about South Africa today, particularly since it's been in the news for the past 2 months. Today, South Africa is a moderately industrialized country of 48 million people. It is also a member of the G20 group of industrial nations. Its great paradox is perhaps that only about 12 to 15 million of its 48 million people live as if it is an industrial society. 7 million of the 12 to 15 million have only begun to experience a middle-class standard of living in the last generation, shortly before the country's first truly democratic election in April 1994. The social cost of achieving this status have placed a crushing burden on South Africa's remaining 30-odd million people. After the Sharpeville massacre of the 1960s, and I may be talking about history that those of you who have not taken my lecture course probably don't know about, or at least not extensively, but trust me, okay? After the Sharpeville massacre, the South African state was crafted around 4 major policy objectives. 1, tighter racial exclusion, at least until 1985. Anti-black urbanization, based on recommendations of even earlier commissions in 1952, 1923, and 1925. Quote-unquote Bantu education, and finally, separate, quote-unquote, separate development, which combined with the periodic expulsions of hundreds of thousands of people from the cities and towns, just as hundreds of thousands more were finding their way to the cities in defiance of the past laws. Precisely because at the moment of the Sharpeville massacre, South Africa's industrial expansion industrial growth was running in exponential terms. so much to the point that, say, by as late as, say, 2007, 1/3 of all of the right-hand drive Mercedes-Benzes and BMWs and Dodge Durangos driven by Americans were produced in South Africa and shipped to the port of Charleston, South Carolina. But the problem is, of course, is that you can't have a man or a woman producing a car who is walking to work or riding to work on a bicycle, right? That becomes extremely problematic. As horrible a man as he was, Henry Ford had the vision to see that a long time ago. So the situation then in the 60s and 70s was extremely paradoxical and ironic. On one hand, thousands of people, thousands of Africans, hundreds of thousands were being pushed out of cities, and an even greater number were stealing back into the cities to people these new industries. The auto industry expanded industrial production in a number of areas. So this kind of social engineering became virtually impossible to enforce in any coherent fashion. However, many of apartheid's architects who had hoped for a German and Axis victory during the Second World War represented some of the last remnants of the kind of authoritarianism that threatened the entire globe after the Great Depression. I'll come to that a little later. Many of the, if you looked at, say, John Balthasar Forster's cabinet in the 1970s, there was not one minister who had not been imprisoned or sequestered during the Second World War for Nazi activity. And I'll come back to that. I'm certain there'll be questions around that. Apartheid's legacy gave a particularly perverse twist to the failure to invest sufficient resources in human capital and public education. For example, between 1994 and 1999, during apartheid's protracted demise under the First and Second African National Congress governments, South Africa paid off a large portion of its debt. Ironically, the governments of P.W. Botha and F.W. de Klerk had amassed the largest portion of this debt after a state of emergency was declared in 1985, and after South Africa had initiated a massive war of destabilization against Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, and Zambia under the rubric of total strategy. In fact, the latter war began shortly after 16 June 1976, after the 16 June 1976 Soweto or children's uprisings. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives throughout the region, and over 124 of South Africa's 129 cities and towns were administered directly by the South African Defense Force from the end of 1985 to 1990. When the chief of staff, the military chief of staff of the SADF, General Magnus Malan, came before the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he wasn't prepared to answer any questions, but he did have a prepared statement. And one of the most significant lines in that prepared statement was one that said, as of 1985, the ground of South Africa became operational area for the SADF. In other words, the South African state was at war with its own people and its own society. Meanwhile, in 1993, unemployment was 30 to 40% for blacks, 42% for rural blacks, 35% for urban blacks, 44% for black males, and 34% for black females. By 2005, however, the weighted average for black unemployment had grown to 41%. These tragic circumstances have led to a generational crisis of daunting dimensions. How many more minutes do I have? 7, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna skip over. Any discussion of South Africa's generational crisis should also take into account, of course, the dramatic increase in HIV/AIDS cases between 1990 and 1994. This increase may have been due to the undercounting of the black population by the previous apartheid governments. The official figure for South Africa's population was dropped out some 10 to 12 million people as of 1990. Of course, the official population count was 32 or 36 million, and in fact, the population was closer to 48 million. So, this increase may have been due to the undercounting of the black population by the previous apartheid government, that is the apparent increase in the number of HIV/AIDS cases. The opportunistic nature of the disease would also lend itself to the increase. The gutting of South Africa's textile industry and metals trades and the subsequent loss of nearly 200,000 jobs between 1999 and 2003, and the periodic spot labor shortages in various kinds of mining operations have accentuated the implications of the AIDS crisis and added to the quote-unquote globalizing conundrum and disabling social actions. You will remember that in 1999, people in the United States and throughout the Western capitalist countries got introduced to quote-unquote globalization. And in the United States, that translated to something like 1,250,000 jobs being lost in textiles and the metals industries. And South Africa had a comparable loss of jobs based upon this quote-unquote globalization and the gutting of its existing industries. But one has to go back to the beginning of the 20th century to grasp how these apparently South African dilemmas have been aggravated and underscored by the global shift in power and wealth that threatens to short-circuit industrial production in the North Atlantic countries and in South Africa. From the end of the 19th century to the American stock market crash of October 1987, gold and oil were the two great cornerstones of the modern capitalist economy, which is why South Africa has played such an important role in the expansion of Western capitalist countries since 1886, right up to 2007, when it ceased to be the largest producer of gold. Presently, information distributed electronically and broken down into units smaller than milliseconds has become the third great cornerstone of the global economic system, one which combines the mystical and productive capacity of the previous two, that is gold and oil, into one entity by way of microprocessing. The advent of this third cornerstone underscored the shift of the center of the financial structure of the global economy from the North Atlantic countries, including the United States, to the countries of the North Pacific Asian Rim, particularly China, after the October 1987 stock market crash. I don't think any of us can debate that anymore. The destruction of the old industrial pattern of work centered on the notion of the job and the replacement by techniques associated with microprocessing and genetic engineering has produced a formidable means of challenging continued Western dominance of the global economy. For example, China, with approximately 240 million engineers out of its 1.25 billion people, very nearly more engineers than there are people in the United States, has taken up this challenge in dramatic fashion. How does South Africa fit into the scheme of events, processes, and outcomes that have followed? I think that is the greatest challenge facing South Africa in the wake of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the end of apartheid. The recent, and I'm going to shut up now and allow for questions in the third speaker. The recent strikes at Marikana in Rustenburg, which is a place I know fairly well because my most recent book is about that part of South Africa. The recent strikes in the platinum mines at Marikana and the spread to the gold mines and to the auto industry, which is something that doesn't appear in American newspapers much, has powerful portents. And it is also a reflection of the shifting change. Most recently, during the United American election, a number of NPR asked a number of South Africans, well, what do you think about the American election? I said, we don't think about it at all. What we're more concerned with is what happens in China on November the 8th when the Standing Committee of the Politburo comes into place. Because he said the Americans have the same problem we do. They are so concerned with contesting the resources of the state through various political wrangles and political party struggles that they have forgot the importance of governance. And so that is the challenge for South Africa and indeed for the US. Thank you.
Our third speaker for today comes to us from Wesleyan University. Professor Vera Schwarcz is the Mansfield Freeman Professor of East Asian Studies there, and she is also a professor in their history department. She did her BA at Vassar, her master's degree comes from Yale, and she completed her PhD at Stanford University. She is a Chinese historian, and she has used the ideas that she has discovered through China, its art, its language, and its politics to begin exploring ideas of truth. And her talk today is being drawn from her most recent work, which is called Colors of Veracity, A Quest for Truth in China and Beyond. She is also the author of 8 other books. She wrote the prize-winning Bridge Across Broken Time, Chinese and Jewish Cultural Memory, Time for Telling Truth is Running Out, Conversations with Zhang Shenfu, and The Chinese Enlightenment. And very recently, she published Place and Memory in Singing Crane Garden, which centers on problems of truth in comparative history. In addition, she has become very interested in poetry and in other ways of exploring language and ideas of truth. And so she is also going to be drawing upon that for us today. Let us welcome her.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Marla, thank you, Rachel, and thank you above all for Sigrid Schmalzer. There's truly no greater joy. There are many Confucian sayings, many other sayings, but to see your student flourish as an extraordinary scholar is truly one of the greatest joys of one's life. It's my life. And to see Sigrid become an important China scholar and important comparative historian has been, and a mother, again, it's been a joy beyond words. So I hope that some of the things I will talk about will be China-based, but hopefully will raise some of the themes of the whole series because I've been thinking about it. I haven't been here, but they speak to many of my concerns as it is. And I actually was thinking about Kenneth Feinberg's book, What is a Life Worth? And maybe that's one of the underlying, that's about the 9/11 compensation dilemmas. But to just even ask that question, what is a life worth? Might be one of the questions that historians don't do enough. And it takes courage and a certain kind of historical and political perspective. And I thought about it in China. And so that question is not asked, or there's a brutal answer on a Chinese blog, $3,125 for a dead kid, and much more for an injured kid. So a truck driver in China backed up and killed the kid to be able to pay less. So it's an important question, what the human life is worth. When you think about China, if China is apples and oranges, why bother throwing in China? Because among many things we're talking about before the panel, on one hand, China has the longest recorded history, one of the most politically manipulated historiographical traditions, which nonetheless, despite extraordinary political entanglement, always had a place for and a commitment to truth. And we could talk about that for a long time. I'm not going to go there. But along with this politically embedded historiography, it's also a culture that's very seasoned, especially linguistically and politically, to indirectness. Classical Chinese is gorgeously indirect, and therefore it can dance around truth with extraordinary skill. And indirectness in the 20th century has been a way of unmasking the pretensions of lies, of a lie-filled history, of a culture that pretends to be virtuous, and in fact it is murderous. So some of you here might have read the works of Lu Xun, China's most famous 20th century writer, and his first vernacular story called The Diary of a Madman, where a madman, in quotation marks, reads the ancient classics that are all about virtue and morality and says, what is the take-home message? Eat people. The great Confucian tradition is nothing but cannibalism. That's a pretty raw reading or rereading of the past. Because you talked about poetry, there's a very well-known historian, poet working in Taiwan, suffered being jailed in the Chiang Kai-shek regime. His name is Bo Yang. Building upon this 20th century quarrel with the pretensions of a history filled with lies, he says, each time, this is a poem in Chinese, each time I spread out history's scrolls, I am filled with horror at all that I read, this so-called land of justice and prosperity. The poem is called On Reading History. So I will very briefly touch upon some big questions around some cute images. This is a cartoon that appears on one of the many blogs that dance around the Chinese censors. We are very grateful for a group of very brave Chinese young people, mostly based in Berkeley, who run the website called China Digital Times, and they scan the Chinese web. And every day they publish the latest 12 words that are banned on that day. And so this is a cartoon that appeared in September called Reading Truth. And it's wonderfully, it's one of the key words of the Chinese political discourse today is harmony. The harmonized society, which means one of its extremely repressed society. So it's called Hershey Farm, the harmonized farm. And one of the cartoonists that works for them produced this. First in Chinese, it has Zhen Li. And what I love about it, in addition to this, forget about who the Red Devil is. We can come back to that. But what I asked you to think about in reading is that reading truth, especially with a historical perspective, might be nothing more or less than being able to honor the lacunae of history. Professor Barkan talked about very eloquently, we're going to come back to, you have to know the facts if you want to dig a grave. Are there bodies in this mass grave or not? And sometimes we really must, I think always we must dig beneath that ground. In this case, what I want to suggest is that one of the things that historians do is simply map the scissors, as you see them on the wall, the instruments of state and social repression that cut out veracity, cut up the bits of truth from history. So what we have are really the holes. Like they're black holes in physics, they're black holes of history. And what I love about the cartoon, that it honors that, the scissors. There are small scissors, big scissors, my scissors, your scissors. And what maybe is left of history is just that kind of frayed lace-like fabric filled with the holes of what cannot be named and cannot be spoken. So I just want to mention a couple of quick examples about that. And again, they're not necessarily some in China, but if you haven't encountered Jeffrey Hartman's very important 2002 book called Scars of the Spirit, The Struggle Against Inauthenticity, in this book, which is not about China, it's not about the repressive communist regime, but about the predicament of modernity post-Holocaust, deafness to testimonies about the Shoah. One of the things that he talks about, what is a historian? He urges us to take up what he calls the Philomela Project. By the way, am I speaking too fast? Yes? I have an accent, I speak fast, so please raise your hand if I'm rushing ahead of you. Can you hear me? Great. So what Hartman talks about is the Philomela Project, using the myth of the nightingale, which is talking about Philomela being a young woman who was raped by her brother-in-law, who also cuts out her tongue. And she wants to tell her sister what happened. And so she weaves a cloth to say what she cannot say. And we talked about the cloths of memory. which bear witness. And so here is the Philomela project, that one of the things that Hartman urges historians to do is to weave cloths that speak indirectly, that's name the unnameable, or make sure that those holes in the fabric, as in Philomela's fabric, show through. So there are a couple of Chinese I just want to mention because you might want to, in your readings or in your conversations, to come back to them that have done just that in the last decade for sure. One of the ones, again, whether you're Chinese or not, is a woman called Zhang Yihe, who in 2002 began a work that won the Chinese prize for pen in 2005, and the book is called Wang Shi Bing Wu Ru Yan, which means past events do not vanish like smoke. She was a literary scholar, the daughter of the most famous victim of the 1957 anti-racist campaign, silenced for most of her life. She said, I turned 60, it's long after Mao, it's long, let me try. The book was promptly banned. But I think for us, not only in China, but here, past events do not vanish like smoke. There is something about the past, as we heard, that endures, that weighs us down. And it could be that it leads us towards conflict, but it also is that anchoring mechanism that allows us to walk on this earth with some strength. The other kind of figure in China that many people admire, including the Nobel Prize Committee, is Liu Xiaobo, the man who won the Peace Prize in 2010, who is now in jail for probably 30 words that the government found unconscionable in a document called Charter 08. But one of the things we can talk about Liu Xiaobo in other contexts, but what's interesting to me is how he has chronicled before his current imprisonment. He has chronicled amnesia about the events of 1989, the Beijing Spring, the Tiananmen events. Why won't China remember? So the answer is very simple. The government won't let. Is it that simple? The turning the gaze inward to what's the problem with truth? We know that it cannot be spoken. The scissors are too big, too active, too voracious, if you will, on the fabric of history. So here's Liu Xiaobo on the 15th anniversary of the Tiananmen events. He had already been jailed. My experience after being released from prison in October 1999 has led me to acknowledge a sad fact. The combination of terror, indoctrination, and distortion of history, combined with the analgesic effect of prosperity and personal profit, has effectively washed away national memory. The truth can be replaced by the power of the rod. Memories can be replaced by lies. Common sense can be overcome by clever wordplay. Conscience can be bought with money. The blame for this national amnesia, whether voluntary or involuntary, must be placed with officials and the people who personally experienced the 1989 movement, who succumbed to government terror and bribery by being silent. It's so easy, even though it's very risky, to point the finger to structures of oppression that prevent us from speaking the truth. It's so much harder to think about the bribery within, the covenant of silence that we make in order to be safe. Liu Xiaobo has been one of the few voices that refuses this covenant of silence that blankets China. Now, I know that in the series, the Feinberg series, you've already discussed the issue of, is memory, in fact, truth? Again, we are long past that whole psychological studies that said, women, remember rape that wasn't really rape, or my father abused me or really didn't abuse me, so we can talk about the veracity of memories, which comes also in question with testimonies about the Shoah and the deniers of the Shoah. But I think in light of your series here, is memory a key aspect of truth that maybe we just want to leave with? Next, just Chinese characters look great. And because by looking at Chinese, you don't have to know Chinese, but it kind of quite literally enables, forces a shift of the gaze. So this is a Chinese word for truth. Chinese words don't mean one thing, they mean 50 things. So it's pronounced as zhen. And again, what I'm trying to assert that seeing truth, what's under this ground, are the bodies here or not, might be impossible without seeking truth. It's not so easy to see truth unless you are engaged in a quest, in a seeking. And the seeking is as much inward as it is outward. So the character for Zhen in the Chinese ancient etymological tradition explains it that on the bottom you have an altar. That's a kind of a line with the two strokes on the bottom. In the middle you have an eye, obviously a pupil. And what you have on top is a hand, kind of grabbing quite literally the pupil of the eye, this eye and this eye, the self as well as the seeing eye, and shifting the gaze. So very embedded in the Chinese character for Zhen, for truth, is this notion of shifting one's gaze, engaging internal and outward processes that focus, force, enable the shifting of perspective. Because there's a constant narrative. In order to see truth, you have to be dislodged. You have to be shoved off the comfort zone. So one of the things that truth does, it scrambles the categories of normative seeing, and if it's successful, it is able to lead to a fresh appreciation of the facts that perhaps have been there all along. So what you have below here, actually, there's my research assistant gave the first one, but there's a much better translation in the new PPT that we did. But in Chinese, it says 真人面前不说假话, which means not tell the truth before an honest man, one of the interpretations, but a more evocative translation of that very common Chinese saying is, there's no need to lie in the face of persons of truth. So what's a 真人? What's a person of truth? But the idea that there's a kind of social, political, historiographical collusion that allows us to absorb and retell lies. And if we were truly truthful, then we would not be such an absorbent fabric for the vociferous lies that surround us. The obstacles to seeing truth. So in Chinese, 真人 is a very classical term for the sage. Now the sage can live under the worst emperor and very rarely under enlightened emperors. My colleague Steve Engel has finished writing a book about sagehood. But the sage is a self-actualized person. Sometimes it's about Taoist immortals who fly on cranes. But there's something about being a 真人, a person of truth, is that a person who has enacted these operations on his own eye and on his own or her own self that allows them to be worthy of becoming a receptacle for truthfulness. And this is where Zhen can be truth, sincerity, truthfulness. So just want to read you a very brief passage from a work by Mike Martin, who's a philosopher who was contributing to a book about Herbert Fingeret, and using certain key ideas in Chinese philosophy around the Zhen. Truthfulness is caring about truth and manifesting that care in belief, reasoning, speech, conduct, and relationships. It should be distinguished from knowing particular truths. This is the empirical mandate, which is truth awareness, and stating truth, which is truth-telling, maybe like in the South African Commission. Truthfulness with oneself avoids instances of self-deception and builds the relationships built on trust. And again, if you look at the origins of the word for truth in English, it's related to the word troth, like to betroth. Before you commit to marriage, you have a troth, which is truthfulness. Are we really being honest with each other? So there's a question about being worthy of trust in order to be a truthful person. Again, this is a kind of stark way of looking at becoming honest with oneself before one demands truthfulness in public realms. So just mention very briefly two instances from China that are moving to me. One of them, some of you might know, an important writer, critic, who stays out of jail only by the slimmest thread, a man named Xu Yu, who was a teenage Red Guard, and in addition to defending Liu Xiaobo and signing Charter 08, he's been writing an extraordinarily honest, truthful account of the Cultural Revolution, of his own role in it, and talking about the need to build a Cultural Revolution museum where, as he says, you can take off your face, you can stop pretending. This wasn't, one man's madness. The way the Great Famine in China, I'll come back to a minute, is not one man's madness. The atrocities in China cannot be laid at the footsteps of Mao or at his wife Jiang Qing or 3 of her cohorts of 4, they are an intrasocial brutality that Xu Yu has started to document, starting with himself. I spit on my teachers. I burnt their books. I made my parents be jailed. It's hard. But that's Jun. It's so easy to say, you did it to me. It's a very different thing to become that person who's there to say, I did it. And again, these are a man who could easily be portrayed as a victim, but daring to travel that gray space between victim and perpetrator. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read an extraordinary letter I just got from a young woman in Sichuan who's translating some of my poems in Chinese. But I want to end with the theme of breaking the habits of speechlessness. So the man who just won the Nobel Prize for Chinese literature, a man named Mo Yan. Mo Yan is a pen name by a very talented writer, not the best writer. No question this is a bone to China. Many previous Nobel laureates said that this is a travesty, a tragedy. I'm not sure exactly how I feel about it. But Mo Yan is a pen name that this man adopted because his father was persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. And as a young Red Guard, just like Xiuyu, his father told him before he left the house, don't say a thing. So he chose as his pen name, Say Nothing. Mo Yan, shut up. That's his pen name, the man who just won the Nobel Prize. So the day that the prize was released, the Chinese caricaturist said, all of China is in a no-speak mode. So Mo Yan wins the Nobel Prize, and all of China is under the ban of no speech. And they showed Nobel, the picture of Nobel with a his mouth tied up. So there's a lot of criticism inside China about why this particular leader who's in good terms with the party. But the idea that China as a whole, on one hand, is screaming the name of Mo Yan because the government is pushing up his works now because he's finally China as a Nobel laureate, while all of China is in fact under the ban of Say Nothing. So clearly that ban is being broken all the time. Every day on the web, 12 words are outlawed, another 24 others are invented to go around the government censors. It's a marvelous game, which I like to follow sometimes. There's significant breakthrough in this muffling. Again, I would urge you to look at this new book that came out about the famine that killed 45 million people in China between 58 and 62, called Tombstone. Talk about memorials. A book that, we know from the Holocaust that we have memorial books. So the man whose father died of starvation, writing this scrupulously young Jisheng, who documents the atrocities in depth. But what I want to end with, because I want to leave time for comments, so therefore I'm rushing fast, is one of the passages that I chewed over a lot as I was working on my book on the colors of veracity. Clearly, truth has not one color, but many. It doesn't mean that truth doesn't exist if it appears in many colors, in many gazes. We are obliged, especially as historians, to keep scratching at that surface of recalcitrant lies. So to go back to the ancients, Cicero, in his very famous passage in the Oratore, in which I will ask my colleague in Latin, so I like the Latin. Historia vero testis temporum, lux veritatis vita memoriae magistra vitae. Now the last line some of you might have actually heard, history as a teacher of life. So you get a PhD in history, hopefully you get a job so you can actually feed your family. But there's a notion among the ancients that history is the primary source for wisdom about life. Now in the last 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, certainly, we have dethroned history. Very few of us look to history for lessons of life. But what if we were, as we heard? What if that's really one of the mandates? That in order to create more life on this earth, we actually have to do more history. And then I went back to Cicero, and the conclusion that history can be a teacher for life, a source of wisdom, are three other preconditions which we don't hear about. Which it says history is a witness of the times. Testis temporum. Again, we talked about the Truth Commission. Other kinds of acts of witnessing, be that in The Hague or in Japan, comfort women. To show up, to bear witness, that we cannot, and that means if you're a young student, you scratch for facts. There's no excuse. You can't do all this theoretical blah, blah. Then you go to anthropology. If you want to stay in history, you really have to find out what happened when. There's no way around that. You have to do that. Testis temporum. Bear witness to the past. lux veritatis. There is a light to truth. Now, again, all this critique of the Enlightenment, as being, all sorts of critiques of the arrogance of reason. I think we need to recover in this post-Enlightenment age the fact that there is light in truth, that truth can, in fact, cast some light. And it's better to have light than darkness. We're entering the season of light. And then the other thing is vita memoriae, that there's a life of memory, that in order for history to become magistra vita, in order for history to really enrich life with its wisdom, it has to itself make some kind of peace with and embrace with memory. With all of the fragility of memories, with all of their faultiness, it is important that history bring memory to the fore, be that through oral history or other kinds of documentations. So let me end here, and thank you so much for the opportunity to address. I presume you want to...
All right, we have now reached what is usually for me my favorite part of a panel like this, the part where you get to start asking them questions based upon what you have heard this evening. So I'd like to invite our other two panelists to join us up here at the front. There is a microphone. Please come and use it so that everyone can hear what it is that you want to ask them, and there are no private conversations that you get to have with our panelists until the night is over. But yes, come, ask what you're wondering.
So, history of human rights is a growing field by which we're trying to trace the ways human rights comes into history. There are those that look all the way back to religious traditions and try and find those that look to the revolutionary age, 1849 and 1948, and the mid-1970s. So there are different periodizations and different ways of what you identify as human rights and the history of that and what are the various components. However, when I talk about history as human rights, is precisely the kind of things that advocates are looking to promote, redress and accountability and dialogue over violations of what is called now as crimes of atrocity. So when the subject of human rights is not, you're not studying it, but you are using it as a form of advocacy to really address the questions of that usually human rights is looking into the forward, but because so much of it is part of our identity, the introduction of advocacy into into history is something that I think is different than actually the history of human rights.
Excuse me, so I want to give an example. Because it's very, not always it can be done in the local context, but we talked about the role of outsiders. So for example, how many, I can't see very well throughout the whole room, but how many young Chinese come abroad in order to study Chinese history, in order to be able to rectify the record from without? And then at what point can they go back and bring that kind of veracity, be that about Japan, of course the events of 1989, or the Boxer Rebellion, which is still being hijacked by a narrative, by a nationalist narrative. So again, the notion of history as a human right that is forbidden in China. and that it can be enacted from abroad, and then it can seep through by bringing facts to the back to native ground. So it's a critical distinction. Thank you.
My question is about the discourse you spoke of that historians could at least help resolve some of these confusions, and whether or not the way culture, kind of this globalized culture that moves forward so fast right now, that people information is just put out there and kind of stacks up with itself. Like, could this discourse possibly be crushed under that right now? Would it, you think that there's a chance that that could harm that type of perspective?
Question.
So the question is, isn't the information, the glut of information, will overwhelm what I'm suggesting in terms of addressing history as a form of a redress or conflict resolution? Did I understand you correctly? Okay. So, Vera gave now an example of what is sort of specifically, a specific example how doing the kind of, writing the kind of history as a human rights intervention in Chinese society. We are always in danger of being ignored. In fact, that's the regular state of life for most of us, I assume. But I think that conflicts are engendered by people who are committed to certain issues. Because certain issues are very important to certain constituencies, and that's where the core of the conflict is. So the questions of whether it's going to be drowned or not is not an a priori. It's not an external theoretical question, but it's a question of advocacy. It's a question of the constituencies that are engaged in it. We heard about South Africa and about the questions of what is important. So this Truth Commission is important, or the mining, the social reforms, the economic reforms. So what do we privilege? We privilege what hurts us. We want to listen, we want to get attention to what is injured, what injures us. And I think in that regard, there is very little risk that it won't be paid attention to if it addresses the questions that are most pertinent to a society. Now, the point is, which I think is very pertinent to what you raise, is there is a danger. There is a danger that revenge and animosity and partisanship would dominate the conversation. There's no doubt that those people who want to advocate their perspective will continue to do it. What is more difficult, and what I'm interested in, is actually encouraging those who are not coming from a partisanship perspective, and this is perhaps not their most urgent topic, the most urgent issue, but to intervene in it from a different perspective, to emphasize empathy and to show openness to the other side. That's where you can bridge the historical perspective and do the kind of work that you have heard from the other panelists as well. So it is, we always can be drowned out by other issues. The main thing is that I see the main danger is being drowned out by nationalists. Not by lack of knowledge, but not by lack of attention, but by over-attention from a nationalist perspective.
That you pose a very interesting question, and I think Professor Barkan, I promised to look at his problem of what we know about the people, about the victims but from a different vantage point. And I want to, again, remind you to have a look at if you don't read the whole book, but if you just read the first couple of chapters of Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, you get a very interesting answer to your question, which it has made me rethink some of the material I'm working on in terms of collective violence in South Africa. He said, look, we know the significance of the victims in the case of the Holocaust. We know that they were significant. He says, but if in order to reconstruct what happened, we also have to think about the significance of the perpetrators. That if you do not, because the perpetrators have the answer, they are the link to the causal explanation for this atrocity or happening. And so significance in and of itself is not a causal explanation for these horrible events that we have been repeating. You have to treat the perpetrators not as cardboard cutout figures or caricatures, but you have to think of them as human beings. And you also have to think that the horrible things that they did, that any one of us and any other group of people is eminently capable of doing the same thing under a given set of conditions. So first thing to do is not to make the perpetrators caricatures. And then you can really get at, why some of these things happen.
My question is about social media, and do you think it can play a role, whether helpful or harmful, in reconciliation, such as like spreading what people may think is happening in a certain country, and it's not necessarily actually happening that way?
What do you think? Yeah.
Well, I think that social media, it is helping to spread the word if there's a certain event happening in the country or people in the country want to spread.
So I think that's one of the issues, isn't it? So if you want to spread something, and I'm a historian, and I'm saying, I'm not sure this is the case. Do I have to go fast enough, blog enough, text, tweet fast enough to counter what you're saying? Because what you just heard, that the narratives that are put forth are driven by injury, hurt, and the need to portray one reality. Now, does the speed of the social media and its seeming democratization allow me to counter that? I don't know, because, if you want to, and I think, many of us are, the last war in Israel, which side, about the bombs, I've been following that. It's really interesting. Do you go, which tweet do you see? What's happening? So, just look at what happened in October in Israel, really interesting. Or what happened in Tahrir Square, or what happened in Tiananmen, or what, so I'm not sure, because there's so much need to portray one reality. And it's not just by the state. Sometimes it's, or in Syria. So, it's a real question. So I don't have the answer. I know that what I love about the Chinese social media, that it's really sophisticated and really cool. So the Chinese firewall, which is really strong, is a paper tiger, to quote Chairman Mao. I mean, it's amazing to me how people jump the wall all the time, every which way. It's marvelously clever. The stakes right now are not bodies, right? There are some bodies that are, the Tibetan immolations. The Chinese social media, the Chinese dissidents, if you whatever, they're on top of every immolation, self-immolation from Tibetan, in Southwest China. As soon as it happens, it's out on the Chinese media. It's immediately squelched, but it's out there. We know number 83 has just happened. They got it. So it's very fast, and the government can't shut it down. Now, is that, I'm not sure how that translates to the war in Israel, to Syria, to, I think social media is a very volatile, and so, expression, but can it counter? Can it really counter passion of injury or the need to portray a certain narrative at that moment? I'm not sure. Which is why I want to ask you.
Perhaps I just add one thing, and that is, there's one issue which you spend, and I think Vera is answering it in regard to the contemporary politics. But if we talk about historical issues, then I would direct the attention to actually various projects that can be promoted through social media. So you can produce in a very localized manner and have exposure which is much wider. I don't think that when we talk about historical events, the immediacy of responses from social media is the question so much, which is very much in questions of politics, in driving of human rights, in driving violations. I mean, nobody will underestimate the role that social media played in the Arab Spring, etc. Or it's completely different situation than in the dismantling of communism when it didn't exist. So that's one aspect of it. But the other is, and I think that you had the opportunity to the project on Guantanamo, for instance, in which you had some in an earlier panel here, and there is a project that actually raises issues with regard to the role of the Guantanamo in historical context in the United States, but is being done by students in different surroundings, and otherwise it will remain in the classroom. This one, it moves beyond the classroom into what would be the impact. I'm not trying to predict that. That's not the issue. There will be many projects. Some of them will be, most of them will be with very localized and limited audience. Some will be much more widespread. So what is creating, it's creating, I think, potential. Where it will go, what goes viral, nobody ever. I don't know that anyone has the knowledge of how to make something viral. That's yet to be discovered, I guess.
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you for your presentation. I want to begin by asking you to think about the question you were raising in terms of collective guilt and history and assigning that. And I want to begin with the premise that there are two countries in the world that have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, right? The United States and Somalia. And the reason the United States hasn't ratified it is that one of the issues is that we begin recruiting soldiers before 18, and that's to some degree in violation of kind of the idea that we don't consider people under 18 to be adults. And so there's a kind of nervousness about, I think, turning that issue back to the US. The reason I wanted to ask you to think about this is that some of these issues, some of the intrastate genocidal situations like Rwanda were really populated and perpetrated often by child soldiers in Rwanda, often supplied arms by the United States. When we begin to sort of, when we begin to privatize arms manufacturing in this area after the Vietnam War, one of the effects is that we begin supplying armaments on both sides of these kind of intrastate actors. And so the question I guess I have to you is, as we begin to think about the role of history and truth and issues of thinking about perpetrators and our own role in that, is there a place for this, or is truth and reconciliation really about reconciling within a particular conflict rather than sort of making our own role globally a subject of discussion?
There are no prescriptions. So there is no one answer to give that kind. I mean, it's a hugely important dilemma. In fact, I struggled with that very much in the book that I wrote. It's called The Guilt of Nations. And the guilt that I identified is not the guilt that I attribute to a particular nation, but the guilt that is self-recognized by a group for whatever it thinks it's responsible for. And I thought, before 9/11, it's an old book, so ethics seemed to be in the 90s, like before the war on terror. I think we may go back to that period sometimes when we'll end the war in terror. But there was a period in the 90s where at least I think some others also, were misled to think that politics will be influenced by ethics more. And the recognition, the questions of guilt in that regard is not an absolute guilt. It's not an external guilt. It's what one thinks one is responsible to, both as a citizen and as a member of a society, and what one can persuade the society in which one lives in to take that kind of responsibility. So that differs in your role in your place in the society, in which society you are, what does it mean to be guilty, etc. So when I talk about collective guilt, it's not so much of attributing to collective guilt, but of accepting collective guilt. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, American exceptionalism includes the adamant refusal to acknowledge responsibility, whatever that is, in whatever category, whether it's Guantanamo, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's slavery, whether it's indigenous. There is a long list of topics in which advocates in the United States have tried to raise the consciousness about issues that we need to apologize about because we took positions which we feel in retrospect are immoral, and therefore we should be accounted for. So whether the particular questions of supplying weapons in Rwanda it happens to be the machetes, so it was not, perhaps that's not the most, would be on the top of the list, but there are so many other issues, and this one may be the one that is important to you. And that is the role of advocacy. That is about what it means about recognizing collective guilt. Now, but you did mention a critical point, which is child soldiers. That's when we talk about where does responsibility, how does responsibility between perpetrators and victims, where do you delineate in it? Where do you delineate the role of child soldiers? I mean, at what stage does a child ceases to be a victim and becomes a perpetrator? I don't know that I can provide an answer, but I would say that if we can agree that it's a space where the two categories coexist, and it's really about resolving it rather than accountability so much, which is, again, what I was speaking about in terms of transitional justice rather than as a social solution, then I think that the dialogue about collective guilt is more important than the legal definition of it.
Yeah, I want to address Laura's question on two levels. I ended my lecture class today on power and violence in South Africa. But, I mean, a large number of students expressed amazement and surprise at the extent to which the United States was involved in conflicts not only in Southern Africa but elsewhere. Some of you are old enough to remember a rather self-serving editorial that Chester Crocker, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State for African Affairs, wrote called "Death is the Winner in Africa," which is a complete fabrication. It completely masks the role of the Reagan administration in ratcheting up the arms war and using the South Africans and Jonas Savimbi in Angola and the Renamo people in Mozambique to orchestrate a war that killed several 100,000 people. Now, what I ended by saying to the young people that one of the things that you have to appreciate is the arrangement that came into existence after the end of the Second World War. When the people who, the quote-unquote wise men, Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, John McCloy, who went to school just down the road here at Amherst, and left his papers there. And there's a lot, you know, if you want to find culpability, look at McCloy's papers and Dwight Morrow's papers over in Amherst College. They may shut them down since I've said that now. But one of the things that was implicit in the kind of United States foreign policy and domestic policy that they created was, one, they said to the majority of people in this country, not everyone, but a significant number of people, that look, we will give you the highest standard of living in the world, just as long as you don't ask us how we do it, just as long as you don't ask us about why we overthrew Mossadegh in Iran, why we overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala, you know, and the list is endless, right up to why we created a sort of a sly monster like Paul Kagame in Rwanda. So, you have to, when you raise a question of guilt, you have to realize that as Professor Barkan said, that the majority of Americans have been in denial about from everything from the Civil War on. Right? One reason you can't get a straight answer from an American about why the United States is in Afghanistan or Iraq or was in Iraq is because people still don't understand why, are still in denial about why the Civil War was fought.
This is probably going to be like a very badly worded question, but I wanted to ask about like how economics how it has a role in truth and reconciliation, because you were talking about, Professor Higginson was talking about how the platinum mine crisis in South Africa and the gold mine crisis, and how it had something to do with American companies, American car companies. And so I just wanted to know that, like, how the economics of maybe this country or of those countries can help bring about truth and reconciliation, if that makes any sense, or, sorry.
Well, since you put the question to me, I'll go first, and then my colleagues may want to come afterwards. Yes, platinum plays a very important part in the economy of the Western countries. I mean, you can't run a car without platinum, right? In addition to the fact that it's used for precious metals, I mean for luxury items too, like jewelry and so on. But how do we address the inequality and the disparity and quality of life and the standard of living and for people in South Africa? We can do that by compelling the country in which we live to be honest about its connections to other countries in the world and why those connections obtain. We can also, as people did during the 80s and 90s, put pressure on financial institutions to disinvest from these places where the state and the political leadership does not value its citizens. There's an interesting letter, and this is long before you were born, certainly. Thomas Lamont, who none of you probably know this name, but Thomas Lamont was the chief executive officer of Morgan Guaranty Trust, which in the 1920s, well, from the banking crisis of 1907 up through the recent times, was arguably the most powerful bank in the world, not just in the United States. And Thomas Lamont wrote a letter to the then Prime Minister of South Africa, Jan Smuts, in 1937, just on the eve of the Second World War. the letter, I can't quote it exactly, but it said, he wrote 2 letters, one public, one private, because Lamont was the godfather of 2 of Jan Smuts's sons. And the public letters went something like this. It says, do your people, that is white South Africans in this case, do your people realize the advantage that we have handed, the United States has handed you by undervaluing the price of gold at $35 an ounce? He says and what he was trying to do is to put some courage into Schwarcz, because Schwarcz was facing a white electorate that was almost to a person not in favor of South Africa entering the Second World War on the side of the Allied powers. In fact, most Afrikaners and many English-speaking people wanted South Africa to either remain neutral or weigh in or have positive neutrality in the way that Spain and Portugal had with respect to the Axis powers. And so Lamont was trying to sort of build up Schwartz's courage to face down the proto-fascist in his electorate. But he was also saying, his closing line was, look, you must realize that it is now the United States who is buying most of your gold and not Great Britain. So you owe us, so to speak. He didn't say it in just that way. But you need to be, a good junior partner and silence all those, the Ossewa Brandwag and all the other sort of proto-fascists in your constituency, and lockstep and join us in the war against the fascist powers. Now, that's how things are done. They're done in private. The only way I know about that letter, which is in the Baker Business Library at Harvard, is, I looked through Lamont's papers there. But why isn't that public knowledge? Right? Because people who have power are not interested in disseminating information about why they do what they do. In 1975, you probably weren't alive then, there was a huge municipal bond scandal in New York that almost caused a recession in the United States. And it came right at the time of the Watergate scandal. And David Rockefeller was the center of that, because it was Chase Manhattan Bank that had floated all of these New York municipal bonds overseas and almost caused this recession. And so some crackerjack lawyer for the SEC, straight out of Yale or somewhere, decided, or Harvard Law School, decided he was going to put David Rockefeller on the spot. They had hearings, much like the Watergate hearings. And so he asked David Rockefeller, after he'd been subpoenaed, he said, Mr. Rockefeller, when did you and the board of directors of the bank decide to float such large quantities of municipal bonds overseas? And where are the notes from that meeting? So, Rockefeller then looked at him like he had crawled out from under a rock. And he said, what notes? What are you talking about? I called the board of directors for a meeting. I asked for a voice vote. And then I proceeded to do what we wanted to do. So you have to remember that people who have power, they're not interested in divulging information about their actions. That's something that can only come about by an active and vigilant political citizenry.
Perhaps let me take a different bite on this in terms of truth and reconciliation. There's one aspect of it which is somewhere between economic changes and symbolic response, and that's the question of reparation. And in fact, perhaps the one thing that the South African Commission failed most miserably in, the Truth and Reconciliation, is actually in implementing its reparation. But there's a lot of cases where reparation, and there is a right to reparation now, which reparation is becoming the symbolic material representation. Why am I saying symbolic? Because we are talking about crimes of the nature of the crimes is such that it cannot be repaired in any manner. So assuming that it cannot be done, the standard cannot, that we cannot match it, then it becomes symbolic. Then symbolically can be actually meaningful. And reparations have taken places in many cases. Historic, transitional justice, etc. In many cases it is very, very symbolic, very minuscule. In others it's more significant. In the United States we had the first one was the Japanese Americans incarceration. There are some people that look at the reparation for indigenous people that actually, for instance, the gambling licenses are as a form of reparations that are being viewed, especially in the California. So there are different, though, there's a lot of reparations in the post-World War II questions. The difference between reparations from World War I, where the victors imposed reparations on the defeated powers, on Germany, and post-World War II, where reparations are by and large accepted and taken on by parties that feel that they are guilty, is the component that bridges the economic changes through material reparations. Perhaps an example of the minuscule reparations is slave labor in Europe, primarily in Eastern Europe, that the Germans paid after 2010, actually, as a result of the Second World War. So in Eastern Europe, there were hundreds of thousands of people who received reparations in hundreds and I think even as low as hundreds of dollars per particular individual. So we'd say is a few $100s for heating in Eastern Europe in the winter. Is that reparation? Is that an economic or is that symbolic? That's at the low end. At the higher end, there's some that involves many more billions, but it still remains symbolic.
Let's do one more question so you can find out who gets to ask it.
I want to thank you folks as well. It's been very interesting. It seems like, to some extent, you're calling on historians to take up roles as public intellectuals to a greater extent than they have, and I think historians have sort of backed out of that in the United States. I know in China there's a literary cultural tradition of the good minister speaking to the bad emperor and being punished, but saying true things anyhow. But my question to you is sort of, how do you get the public to sit still when you want to say to them, this is complicated? I don't have a simple answer. And how do you get people to look in a mirror when what they see might be very unpleasant? I mean, do you have any strategies that you'd like to recommend for us?
That's why I use the character for Jen, because that's exactly the demand to look in the mirror. The sage is not, gets the wisdom from heaven, although he does, or she does, mostly he. But there's that willingness to confront the limitations within. I think the question about do you get the public to sit still, the answer it's not the public. Time doesn't sit still. So we're talking about a historian's voice being interjected in a flow, an increasingly rapid flow of time. So I think I would answer, how does a historian, other than tenure and the issues, but how do you create the space for yourself, for complex reflection? The temptation to testify, to have public impact, actually is very great. Oscar Handler was very eloquent about some of those aspects. So I think, I'm so glad, because I think there's a dimension. I think when we talk about power, it's real. I don't want to diminish the obstruction to truth from the side of power. But I do not want to diminish the obstacles within and the very difficult art of crafting time for complex reflections. It's not easy, and it's one of the greatest challenges that faces us. Not theory, but really allowing the grace to emerge and to show. I guess while I have the floor for just one more second, You know, there's got to be somebody, I'm sure it's been asked before, does truth and reconciliation go together or they don't? There is such a thing, they don't. You know, it just, and you know, let me, not that, you know, to speak truth is to cause you injury, and so my injury, your injury, you know, so we get at this war of injuries. But, you know, with me, as I was thinking of, you know, we have economic issues, but I'm thinking of the scab literature in China, you know, coming out of the Cultural Revolution, and the beginnings of I was raped, you know, the women that began to tell it, I was beaten, you know, people are beginning to record for the first time the atrocities that they endured. And the question is, how long do you keep picking at your scab in public? So I'll tell you a very quick story, because, you know, we began to write Chinese Jewish memory, you know, Jews never again, you know, they're the ones that are constantly. So, you know, my distinguished colleague at Princeton, Professor Yingshi, said, you know, you Jews just are too obsessed with memory, you know, and go read the Chinese classic that tells you how forgetting is an important part of personal and public mental health. And I went and read the Taoist classic in the Han Dynasty that says, you know, stilling the mind, letting the memories die out is the key to peace. Forgetting is key to peace, not remembering. Very wise. 8 years later, Professor Yingshi calls me up and says, you've got to come to a conference on the Nanjing Massacre. We got to learn about Jews, about how to remember. Because he had a whole generation of Chinese students that never heard about the Chinese Massacre, because everybody's been so good at forgetting. Because, you know, so we have a dilemma. And I, you know, I don't intend to solve it. Is memory good for individual and public mental health? Or is truth good for individual and public mental health? It's a question.
I guess I'm more optimistic. And but my optimism doesn't stem from a division of speaking to the audience, but speaking with the audience, being part of that production. So it's not how you capture the audience and pontificate the truth, but actually how you produce the knowledge with being part of the audience, being part of the group that within which you work. Therefore, although there is a legacy that objectivity preceded, etc., it's always different perspective. It's always speaking from a particular perspective and recognizing that as an empowering position rather than as a limitation, and working together with the other parties is a possibility. So there have been many places in which historians plays and intellectuals, whether it's in experts in courts, or whether it is commissions, or whether it is in projects, or whether it's as individuals. But I think that the one thing that I find that can be done more is to be more responsive to and being more responsive to topics that engage public concerns rather than trying to keep the academic fence around the engagement. So since this is a program that is dealing with public history, I think that there's no better way for me to end my comment on this one.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Let's thank our panelists one last time, and let's also thank Sigrid one last time for all of her work on this.